Hello everybody and welcome back to Not Enough Projects. Today we're going to be getting back on the 72 Nova project. Last time we built up the Ford 8.8 rear end and this time we're going to get it installed. Alright, I've cleaned up the spring purchase a little bit with the grinder and got the axle up into place. And I'm noticing that the U-bolts are just a little bit too large in bolt diameter to fit through the holes, so I'm going to have to pop these off and enlarge the holes just a little bit. Alright, got those holes drilled out. The U-bolts now fit into the spring perch holes. If I can get it in there pretty nicely. Now, this lower mount, the U-bolts almost fit, but if you look down in there, the holes aren't actually concentric. They're kind of cone shaped, maybe a little distorted, but they need opened up just a little bit, so I'm going to run them through with the same drill bit. Alright, I got both sides enlarged and have the leaf springs installed. One thing I am noticing, looks like these U-bolts are a little bit too wide. You can see there's about 3/16 of an inch of room between the axle tube and the U-bolt on each side. That much space would make me uneasy to run it like that. So likely we'll be getting new U-bolts, but for now we can mock it up with these. Let me know what you guys think. If you've ever run an axle with this much space, let me know. I just wouldn't want to because, you know, you want the axle moving around as little as possible, and if the U-bolt is not tight against the tube, then I think it just introduces unnecessary movement. Since this was a Mustang rear end, I believe it was a coil setup, and these axle tubes, I measured them with a caliper, about 2.8 inches. Compared to, I believe, the Explorer, which is normally 3¼ inches. These are 3-inch U-bolts, and that's why we have this space. So I overlooked that. So likely we're going to need to be getting 2.8-inch U-bolts and then just enlarging the holes down here so that the U-bolt will fit. Hook it up, get the pinion angle set, and we can tack the spring perches onto the axle tube. But for now, at least, we can use these U-bolts to mock up the axle housing, make sure we get our pinion angle set properly, and then we can tack the spring perches onto the axle tube. Alright, I've got the driver's side on mostly, and I got the axle housing centered up from the leaf spring. I am running into a little bit of an issue. You can see that the expert bubblegum welds here don't allow enough room for the U-bolt nut. If I remember right, before there was a kind of stud that went up and then the nut was fastened up in here. I'd like to go with the U-bolt, so I may need to grind some of the weld away on this traction bar. See, the same thing is true over here. But beyond that, you can see that the axle's centered up. Once we get this figured out, we're just going to need to support the weight of the rear of the car on the axle and springs. And then we can set our pinion angle, and then we'll tack the spring perches onto the axle housing, and at that point we should be ready to remove the whole axle housing and weld the spring perches on. Alright guys, so I got the weld for the slapper bar, traction bar, whatever you want to call it, ground down so I could get the nuts on for this U-bolt. They're all snugged up, and I've got the whole weight of the car, the rear section of the car, supported on the rear axle housing, so it should now be like as if it had its wheels on. And I got the car as level as I could, not that it strictly matters when we're setting pinion angle, but more so that we know that the weight transfer is about what it should be. I also got the dual pattern U-joint for the drive shaft to yoke installed, and you can see I've got it snugged up there. And additionally, and also the drive shaft is in the transmission. We may be able to get away with this. It may need lengthened, we'll just have to do a check. But for now it's in there enough that we can check pinion angle. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm no master chassis engineer or anything like that. I've done a lot of reading though. And the reason why we need to set pinion angle is because under full acceleration we want the angle of the transmission to be equal, parallel to the angle of the pinion. But under hard acceleration, the pinion wraps up because of the torque from the drive shaft. So the pinion will actually try to rise up. So that's why you have to set the pinion angle slightly negative. So I think I'm going to aim for about 2 degrees negative from the transmission yoke. So the easiest way to do this pinion angle measurement is with a digital angle meter. Now luckily your average modern smartphone has a really accurate gyroscope in it. So I've got this angle measurement app. I'm going to set it so that I can do a relative angle measurement. So now I'll just make sure we're flat on the transmission yoke, and it's measuring angle in this plane. So I've got it flat on there. I'm going to tap. So now this is 0 degrees. So now we're going to go over to the pinion and see what angle we have there. So it's a little tricky to get the camera in there. But I've got it pressed up against the transmission yoke right here, which should be right in line with the, obviously, the pinion. And it's looking like we're at about 5 degrees up, which is the opposite of what we want. So we're going to need to lower it so that this is the measurement that we're getting. So we got to go down about 7 degrees. Alright, I got all the U-bolts loosened up just slightly so that there's not too much tension on the axle housing. So now hopefully, I doubt we'll be able to do this by hand. Yeah, so I'm going to grab a hammer and a block of wood. Alright, let's see what we can do. Okay, before I go too far, I'm going to check if that changed our angle at all. I'm going to re-zero our angle meter on the transmission first. It's better, we're at 3 degrees, 3 to 4 to 3.5 or so now. So we still got a little ways to come down. Three degrees. Still at 3. We may need to jack up from under the springs so that we take the tension off of the top of the U-bolts so that we can actually get this to rotate easier. So yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Alright, so here's what I got going on. Just to take the tension off so that we can rotate the axle housing a little bit. I've got one jack under each spring, just barely lifting it off the jack stands. So now we're going to repeat the process of trying to hammer it down a little bit. Oh yeah, definitely moving that 10. So I'm just going to set it back down, release the pressure from the jacks. I'm going to tighten up all the U-bolts just to make sure we're getting an accurate reading. Okay, all the U-bolts are tightened up. Let's give this another measurement check. Looks like we're now at 2 degrees, pointing up. So we still have 4 more degrees to go. So I'm just going to repeat that again. I'll bring you guys back once I get it. Alright, so after a fair amount of back and forth, I think I've gotten it to a point where it's happy. You can see we've got it zeroed on the transmission yoke. Now we're going to check. It's a little awkward to do this one-handed. And here, and you can see we're just about dead on at 2 degrees pointing down. So I'm happy with that. So now we just need to double check that the axle housing is in the car square. Square is in this way. We don't want one side poking out more than the other. Centered, I guess you could say. And then once we have that verified, we'll go ahead and tack the mounts up. Alright, so it's kind of looking like we are just slightly off. It's probably hard for you guys to see, but on this side we're at about 14 centimeters. Yes, I'm using metric. It's just the decimal's easier for me to think about when I'm doing this kind of stuff. But we're 14 centimeters away from the measurement spot on this side. And from the exact same spot on this side, we are 13 and a half centimeters. So we need to move it towards us about 2.5 millimeters or so. I think what I'm going to do is take the pressure off of it, same way with the jacks, and then beat on it on that side with wood and a hammer. Alright, got the tension off of it. Let's see what we can do. Obviously don't want to overshoot. Haven't moved at all. I need to loosen up the U-bolts a little bit. Okay, I went and took a little bit of tension off the U-bolts. See if we can get it to move now. There we go. I think we are now at, well, we might have moved just like a millimeter. Do it a little bit more. Alright, after a lot of fiddling, we got it dead even on both sides. Now I'm just going to double check the pinion angle since we messed with the axle a little bit. And then we're going to tack up the spring mounts. Alright, so got the stick welder going. I think we're just going to tack and weld it with some 7018 3/32 rod. Nothing fancy. I'm no expert welder, but it's tacked in there. I'm going to go do the other side, and then we can pop the axle back out and fully weld it up. So I got the axle housing out of the car, went ahead and cleaned it up. Now I'm going to weld up the spring perches. I'm just going to use some 7018 rod. Should work out okay. Obviously we want to be careful with our heat input, because we don't want to warp the housing. Alright, I'm going to let that slowly cool back to where it's cool to the touch, and then I'll just work my way around the axle. Alright, certainly not the prettiest welds I've ever done in my life, but they should be more than strong enough. Now we can go ahead and prep the housing for paint, and we also need to do the axle bearings and seals. I'm going to go ahead and try to pop these bushings out since we don't need them for our setup. I'm going to start by trying the air hammer on it. There's one. There's two. Not bad at all. Now I'm just going to finish masking off everything, and then we're going to give this thing a coat of paint. Alright, I went ahead and degreased the axle housing. It's up on stands, so now we can go ahead and get it painted. I'm gonna pop the axle bearings out so we can replace them. Earlier we already did the seals, so we just need to yank these out. I'm gonna use the slide hammer and one of these axle bearing pull tools. You can rent them at auto parts stores. like AutoZone or O'Reilly's, I'm sure has them. So you just put it in like that. I'm gonna thread this nut, and I'm just gonna thread the sled hammer on. Yeah, here we go. Get repositioned here. Easy as that. Having the right tools definitely makes this job easier. Alright, I cleaned up the inside with just some brake clean and paper towels. So now we should be good to get our new bearing installed. I'm going to give it a quick pre-lube just with gear oil. And I'm just using one of these bearing drivers. You can rent them. And we'll just tap it in. You hear the tone change there when it's fully pounded in. Give it a couple taps just for good measure, but it should be set all the way home. Now we get our seal installed. Try to get it as square as we can. This driver doesn't quite fit into the axle, so switch to the smaller one. You hear the tone change there? So we know it's in all the way. And give the seal a quick pre-lube. Probably do it again when we install the axles after we get the brakes set up. So I'm just going to do the exact same thing on the other side. Not much to it. I think I'm going to call it there. Next time we're going to be getting the brakes squared away front and rear. So yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.